Koh Tao Murders, error number 3 from journalists. Insufficient reporting from inside the Samui courtroom. It would have been very informative for the millions of people following the trial of the men charged with killing Hannah Witheridge and David Miller had there been greater reporting of the events inside the courtroom. For example, it was not widely known that one of the lady judges was often dozing during the trial. It was also not widely known that the younger female judge sometimes left the courtroom while evidence was being heard. The judgment was based very much on the notes and recordings made by the senior judge, who was a gentleman. It was also not widely known that the public prosecutor was often dozing during the trial. This was particularly the case when the defence witnesses were giving evidence. He was, by the way, the same person who misled the Samui court by submitting that the police lab had accreditation to conduct the relevant DNA testing, whereas it lacked that accreditation at the material time. He also tendered an unendorsed report as evidence contrary to ISO 17025. Now, to explain what an unendorsed report means, and a distinction with an endorsed report, when a laboratory has evidence to submit to a court, there should be a stamp on the relevant document, and that stamp verifies that the report has come from an accredited laboratory and that the report complied with the requirements under the relevant standard, in this case 17025. In effect, what the prosecutor did was he filed a report that was unendorsed. It did not have a stamp on it, which basically meant that it had come from, in this case, an unaccredited laboratory, because the laboratory did not have accreditation at the time these tests were done. And so it's a bit like having a university degree or a certificate from a university that doesn't exist when you haven't even sat the relevant exams. So it was wide open for people to make accusations that this is a case of scientific fraud. Here's an interesting quote that I found recently. Journalism 101. If someone says it's raining and another person says it's dry, it's not your job to quote them both. Your job is to look out the window and find out which is true. The relevance of that quote will be coming clear very soon. Now here's a quote about the Koh Tao murder trial. The lawyers and judges were often noted to be dozing, and that came from Lionel Blackman, who's a lawyer in Britain, and that came from page 23 of a trial observation report, and I'll have a link to that below the video. Now in a moment I'm just going to take you to a couple of videos of an address from Michael Miller, who's David Miller's brother, and this was after the judgment was handed down. There are actually two videos. One is the beginning of his address and one is the end of his address, and there's a little bit of an overlap, and I will make a couple of comments as we go through.
We are David Miller's family. You would have liked Dave, but he was killed on a beach in Koh Tao in September 2014. He should not have died that night. David died from drowning after being hit multiple times. Blunt trauma broke his jaw, his cheekbone, and fractured his skull. He was hacked down from behind, dragged into the sea, and left to die.
I'll pause it there for a moment. There was absolutely no evidence that David was hacked down from behind. There were cuts to his face, to the front of his neck, and on his collarbone that were inconsistent with the hoe that was used to hit him on the back of the head. So he may well have been struck after he'd already been attacked, and while he was lying down, there was no evidence that anyone crept up from behind him.
That will live with us forever. What happened to Hannah Witheridge is unspeakable. We believe that the result today represents justice for David and Hannah. Like many people, we were initially unsure what to think when Zor Lin and Wei Po were detained as suspects. We saw images of two innocent-looking men surrounded by tough policemen. It was easy to conclude that they might just be convenient scapegoats. However, we resolved to keep an open mind until we had heard all the evidence. Concern for the accused has been widespread. A petition was organised and funds were raised for their benefit. A group of activists became involved and has promoted their cause vigorously to the media. Ultimately, Zor Lin and Wei Po obtained the best possible representation in court by a team of 7 top lawyers.
In relation to the best representation, I can advise that Jane Torpin, who's an international DNA expert from Melbourne, did fly to Samui to give evidence at the trial, but when she met the defence team, the senior lawyers were less than polite to her, and it was quite clear that they had not done any homework in relation to DNA evidence, and they therefore squandered the opportunity to have an international expert there to give evidence who could have cut the prosecution evidence to ribbons. So I beg to differ with those comments.
Over the last few months, we have attended many of the court sittings, and we have gained real respect for this court. The judges have been invariably diligent, attentive, fair, and extraordinarily hard-working. This has been of comfort to us.
I suppose the obvious comments there are that the evidence about the DNA should never have been accepted by the court. So I would state that it was not a fair outcome that the bogus evidence was accepted, and also given that one judge was sometimes asleep and one judge was sometimes absent, I don't think it's correct to say that the judges were particularly diligent.
David always stood up for justice, and justice is what has been delivered today. We respect this court and its decision completely. As the trial has progressed, we came to realise that the police investigation and the forensic work performed was not the so-called shambles it was made out to be. We believe that, after a difficult start, the Royal Thai Police conducted a methodical and thorough investigation. Having listened carefully to all the evidence, and despite what their lawyers say, it is out.
In fact, I would state that they did not have all the evidence, because some evidence was withheld from the defence, and of course the evidence of the unsatisfactory nature of the police DNA evidence was not really heard.
Our opinion that the evidence against Wei Po and Zor Lin is absolutely overwhelming. They raped to satisfy their selfish desires and murdered to cover up that fact. They have shown no remorse during the trial.
In fact, there was no compelling evidence to show that either of them had raped anyone or that either of them had murdered anyone.
Initially, they confessed for almost 2 weeks and then recanted in an attempt to avoid justice. We hope the campaigners who have relentlessly publicised this case will respect the process of law and the decision of the court. We believe the correct verdict has been reached.
Okay, I'll now move to the second video. So this will fill in some gaps. There will be an overlap of about 1 minute. And of course the screams you hear in the background are the mothers of the two condemned men.
We believe that, after a difficult start, the Royal Thai Police conducted a methodical and thorough investigation. Having listened carefully to all the evidence, and despite what their lawyers say, it is our opinion that the evidence against Weipo and Zaw Lin is absolutely overwhelming. They raped to satisfy their selfish desires and murdered to cover up that fact. They have shown no remorse during the trial. Initially, they confessed for almost 2 weeks and then recanted in an attempt to avoid justice. We hope the campaigners who have relentlessly publicised this case will respect the process of law and the decision of the court. We believe the correct verdict has been reached. Finally, we'd like to thank everyone who has supported us over the last year. Our thoughts are also with the Witheridge family and the horrors they are also enduring with so much dignity. Our lives have been changed forever. Nothing brings David home. No last hugs, no goodbyes. But whatever our anguish, the love we have for David can never be taken away. Our 24 years of memories and his beaming smile will always be cherished. David was intelligent and hardworking. He was caring, inclusive, enthusiastic, and fun. He is irreplaceable to us. Our hearts will always be filled with the brightness that he brought to our lives. We remain so proud of him. We and his friends miss him terribly.
And the mothers have been told to leave the court building. So that media event came to a very abrupt end. Their sons, of course, have just been sentenced to death. Okay, and those videos, of course, came from AP and Sky News. Now, I'll just go back over here. And just in conclusion, I'll make this little note here. This is a quote from Thucydides, who was an Athenian general and historian in the 5th century BC. He said, most people, in fact, will not take the trouble in finding out the truth, but are much more inclined to accept the first story they hear. And so it's important that journalists do take some effort to get the story right in the first place and don't just quote someone like Michael Miller. And here's a self-evident quote from Professor Brian Cox. The problem with today's world is that everyone believes they have the right to express their opinion and have others listen to it. The correct statement of individual rights is that everyone has the right to an opinion, but crucially that opinion can be roundly ignored and even made fun of, particularly if it is demonstrably nonsense. And I would submit that, with all the greatest respect to Michael Miller, many of his statements outside the courtroom were nonsense. Thank you very much for listening to the end.